Sorry for being a couple minutes behind schedule here, but I think it's going to be a great conversation. With me on stage are Russ Heddleston, founder and CEO of DocSend, and Kader, founder and CEO of ToutApp, and now GM of Marketo Europe. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
I feel like you're wearing a lot of hats at Marketo, so I want to make
Turns
sure.
out 3 jobs at Marketo is the equivalent of a CEO founder job, so that's just about right.
Perfect. So today we'll be talking about parallels between enterprise sales and fundraising. And I'm hoping there'll be some good discussion here on how annoying both investors and early customers are, but also hopefully how helpful. Before we do that, though, I don't know if you guys want to just do a quick blurb on each of your companies and kind of the problem you solve for your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. So ToutApp is a sales engagement platform. Everything from a salesperson getting a lead to closing the deal, we help run the workflow for that. And Marketo is traditionally a marketing automation platform, and they've transformed into a customer engagement platform. So they acquired us about 4 months ago.
Cool. And then DocSend is a sales content management and tracking system. We basically replace attachments with links that tell you how long they look at it and who they forward it to. So we get used a lot in investor fundraising decks as well. So Indy gets quite a few of them. And then before this, I was a product manager at Facebook, and I'm an engineer by background.
Cool. So I always like starting these conversations with a little bit of story time. So I'm going to ask you guys to tell me about, or tell the audience rather, about your first investor, and mom doesn't count, and your first customer, and just how those wins got on the board. So Russ, I don't know if you want to go first this time.
Yeah, sure. So the first investor, I actually have to go back a little bit further just to answer that question, because this is my second company, and the first company we sold to Facebook and as a talent acquisition, and we raised a small round of seed funding, like $500K, and I called it our pity money, because I went off and I fundraised for a long period of time, and it was really painful. And so then post Facebook, I'm doing it again, and I just had a much shorter attention span for the fundraising process, and we did things pretty differently. And the first money we got was from Jeff Clavier at Softtech, who led the seed round. But it was just like very night and day the first time I tried to go through the process versus the second time I went through the process.
What changed besides you being older and wiser?
I think that creating a sense of urgency is important. I think there are some similar learnings to doing sales where you need to pick who you're talking to. You need to have a good pitch for them. You don't want to practice on the people you want to raise money from, and you need to have a deadline for them, all of which really contributed to, I think, having it go so much more efficiently the second time around. And then the first customer we had was actually a reference from one of the investors, Lear Ventures, and they started using our product, and it was free for quite a while. And then later on we went back, we're like, oh, can you pay us, by the way? And we should have asked them earlier.
We're all about actionable insights on this panel. Turns out asking customers for money is a good idea.
Yes.
Man, you guys need more coffee. TK, your shot.
So just to set the context, when I was fundraising, I'm a solo founder, and this is the first time I was fundraising. And so the rule I had was you just always have to say yes, no matter how kind of weird the situation you might be going into might be. So my first real investor wrote a $100K check, and he was a diamond dealer out in New York. And the way I met him, his name is Daniel, great guy. I was pitching the founder of WeWork, and at that time WeWork was just 1 or maybe 2 buildings in New York City. I was starting out in New York City. I was pitching him. He gets on a call in the middle of the pitch, talks to his friend Daniel, speaks in Hebrew. I have no idea what he's saying. He's like, and then he's like, hey, my friend would like to meet you. I'm like, oh yeah, I'd love an intro. He's like, no, right now. So I ran down the street, down Lafayette Avenue, went into some diamond dealer shop, went to the back, showed him the demo, and he kind of like called me the next day. He's like, hey, I'd like to invest. I'm like, okay, how much do you want to put in? He's like, I don't know, how much do you want me to put in? Totally made up the number, 100K, and he said, okay, cool. And that was we ended up raising for our Series B was Andreessen Horowitz, our Series A was Jackson Square Ventures. We got a lot of investors that are quite credible. Daniel was the first money in. So the rule is just don't assume anything about the situation. He was incredibly valuable to the whole process.
Did he hand you a briefcase of cash, or was
It was
that
all
check?
cash deal. I actually just took the money.
Perfect. So Russ started sort of previewing one of the themes of this talk, which is urgency and customer psychology. And part of why I invited these two guys to join us here today is because I generally believe if you can sell software to salespeople, you can sell anything to anybody. Salespeople tend to be pretty skeptical of buying things. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about urgency and customer psychology. In your experience, when you guys are in enterprise sales cycles, customers have their choice of multiple products to buy. There's any number of reasons why there could be a no-deal scenario. How do you be responsive to their needs and drive that urgency? And then we'll flip that same question into fundraising. But I don't know, TK, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, well, I think about the first customer that we brought on. ToutApp started, ironically, we sold to sales teams, but we didn't have a sales team. So you just signed up, swiped a credit card, and that was it. Our first true enterprise deal was one where they were hunting us down. And they were on the phone, and they were saying, hey, we want to buy 300 seats. It was a company called Responses. And I said, okay, cool, like we'll give you pricing. We had never done an enterprise deal before. And then they were like, we have one trick though, or one rule. You can't sell this to ExactTarget if we buy it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, there's just no way this is bad, I won't do it. And I hung up the phone, they called back 3 minutes later, and they said, okay, well, we really want to do the deal, but what if you just limit where you can't do ExactTarget for 6 months, so we have a head start. And between that call, I had looked up that ExactTarget was already trialing with us, and we have no idea because we don't have salespeople. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't. They're already in trial, and they kind of went quiet, and they said, okay, we'll buy right now. And that's where I really learned about urgency. In a lot of things, in fundraising and in sales, you can't manufacture urgency. Urgency comes from the customer. Your job is to identify urgency and why they're driving urgency or the lack thereof. And if you can notice how much they're leaning in as a customer and for why, or as an investor and why, then you kind of figure out, oh, I understand now. Whether it's a business driver or for an investor, a specific theme that they really want to get into. That's the kind of stuff that drives that urgency, and you just got to discover it through asking questions.
Russ?
Yeah, similar process actually for me because I hadn't been in sales before starting DocSend. If you're trying to make a fake sense of urgency, it just comes across as exactly fake, and people get that. So there's nothing you can really make up. You can get lucky enough to be able to find things that are important. It's interesting that for me, some of the things that are actually drive urgency feel kind of fake to me, whether it's end of quarter or there's a new person coming on or end of year cycle. Really just identifying however their business runs and what might be something to create a sense of urgency. Like last year, we had all these deals come in like right at the end of the year because they had to use that year's budget. And so you're like signing contracts like as it's getting closer to midnight on New Year's Eve. But as we ask these questions and we identify these things, then we can actually create that sense of urgency that they're bought into it. But yeah, without that, it's really hard to get anything to move forward.
So it's obviously different when you're talking to investors. Unfortunately, investors have a somewhat indefinite timeline because they can always look at the next company to invest in. Not this investor, I'm very friendly, but all the other investors. Talk a little bit about how you guys sort of manage that funnel and any sort of learnings on this concept of urgency as it applies to, both of you have raised large capital rounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start for this one. I think that for enterprise sales, the sense of urgency has to come from within the company typically. It's not an external force. I think it's often like an internal force as the deal becomes larger. TK, I think what's interesting about your example with Responses and ExactTarget is that one feels a little bit more similar to the type of urgency that's created in a fundraising scenario, where they are more responsive often to external forces. The first time I raised money for my last company, what I did wrong was I would talk to people in serial over time, and what I didn't realize is as soon as you start fundraising, and by fundraising you pitch anybody, if you talk to someone else 2 months later, they'll ask, how long have you been fundraising? And you're like, oh, well, I just kind of started, but you can't really say that because you pitched someone 2 months ago, and then they won't go talk to that person, and then it just looks like you don't have momentum because you've been fundraising for a couple months, and if it was a great company, you have already raised. So that is the exact opposite of creating a sense of urgency. And as you said, Indy, you can always invest in the next one. The best means we found of creating a sense of urgency is pitching as many people in as short a time period as possible. And then the thing that creates a sense of urgency is the uncertainty at what other players in the market will do. And I'm sure there's a lot of wonderful game theory that goes on behind this or something. That's just one way that you can actually create a sense of urgency without there actually being any specific deadline.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the things you have to realize is you're in fundraising and in sales, you're not really selling or fundraising. What you're doing is negotiating. And I always tell founders and salespeople that I work with, don't buy books on sales or startups. Go buy a book on how to negotiate, because that's really what you're doing in all these scenarios. And my favorite book is this book called Start With No. And traditionally, you would go in and you'd just go in like, hey, we're awesome. This is great. You totally should invest, or you totally should buy. The Start With No book is a little bit more about, hey, listen, you're probably not going to invest in this space. Maybe you're not even thinking about it. Or you don't really believe that this is a key value driver that's important to you. You start with that because that gets you their reaction on, is this important to them or not? Do they get it or not? And the sooner in the process that you suss that out, the sooner you can figure out if there's a market for whatever you're doing, fundraising or selling a product, and the sooner you can figure out who to focus on. And I think focusing on the right people, the right customers, and the right investors, because they're not all created the same, is super important. When we were raising for ToutApp, if I walked into a VC pitch meeting and I had to explain to them why sales and enterprise sales is broken and why they need software, like if they don't get enterprise sales, if they've never done B2B investments, I would not pitch them anymore because I can't educate them and catch them up on what 5 other VCs have already learned from managing companies that have sales teams. So focus and filtering people out and focusing on the people that will move is super important in creating urgency, value, and anything else you're doing in a negotiation process.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of the power of a halo effect or communities or buzz in either of these contexts. And it's probably a real question for many of the founders in the room. Trying to build a halo around your company is incredibly hard and can feel incredibly expensive. And so when do you invest those dollars? How do you think about approaching it? How do you think about building advocacy among your customer base? If there's any influitive folks in the room, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that. It can be, in theory, quite powerful in accelerating sales cycles. And believe it or not, VC folks actually do pay attention to products that are trending in their portfolio and then go try to meet those companies and think about whether they should invest. How did you guys approach this concept of customer advocacy or customer communities? How have you harnessed it either in sales or in fundraising?
I can go. I mean, so if you think about it, let's start with the common knowledge. In your pitch deck, you have the logo slides of here are all the amazing companies that are using us. In your sales deck, you have here are all the amazing companies that bought from us. One of the things you want to do for each of those to create the halo effect is to personalize those. So when we pitched Andreessen Horowitz, our slide deck was here's all the B2B companies in your portfolio that are already using ToutApp in their sales team. And that just made it super easy for them to understand, oh, I can reference check this, and I know these companies, and they're clearly doing well, so there's something here. Same goes for customer pitches. When we actually pitched Exact Target or any of the, so at one point we had every single file sharing company as a customer. And the way we pitched all of them, all the way down to the long tail, including web conferencing companies, is we said, hey, these other companies in your space are already using us. So that creates that localized halo effect. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that you can do. I think that in a global basis, like beyond that local hack that you can have, we had a customer advisory board, which compared to Marketo's customers, it looks like a crayon drawing. We had like four really great sales leaders, and we talked to them, but we always had them on call for references. So those things, they seem like super easy and obvious, but man, they're so powerful in every sales process. And so I would just say do the hard work in that because that pays off dividends.
A quick chime in before we switch to Russ. There's a set of things only the founder can do. Even if you've raised venture capital and you've added out a team under you, a customer advisory board is one of those things. If you're purely thinking of it as a check the box exercise, it will be that, and the founder doesn't need to do it. If it's going to be this weapon that helps you win accounts and drive credibility in your ecosystem, you got to go find not just a check the box customer, but somebody that the whole ecosystem respects. And for that person to give you time, that is an exercise in founder reality distortion field, and nobody else can do that for you. So,
That's totally right.
Yeah, I think for the early sales, if you don't have enough money or time as a company to invest in giant branding exercises where you blanket the earth, the next best thing is to surround a target account with social proof that says you are this huge thing. They just haven't heard about you yet, but they should have heard about you. And one of those ways is
if you were cool, you would have heard about us.
That's right, yeah.
Or you may not have heard about us, but these people have. Start with no.
Yeah, and certainly competitors is one way to go. If it's other companies in their portfolio, it's a good way to go. But what's the social proof that you bring as evidence that says they should trust you when the number of employees you have on LinkedIn would otherwise not necessarily indicate that you should win this deal? And there's also a bit of like the FUD sale that you can employ here, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Your competitor has a key advantage over you unless you also use our system. And doing that in a tasteful and tactical way, I think, is important because you can definitely overplay it in a way that is off-putting to some companies. So yeah, certainly with those early sales. And then the other thing that's nice about the advocacy board is you just make them feel so important to you. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing I didn't realize the importance of. I mean, when I go sign up for a software product, I'm not thinking to myself, oh, this company cares about me personally. But when you're doing more mid-market or enterprise sales early on, whoever your champion is inside the company, making a personal promise to them that says, I care about who you are and your opinion, and I want to work with you on this, like that actually does go a long way. And that's something you can offer that maybe a much larger incumbent can't offer. And so that can actually really help you get those deals done in lieu of not having a giant branding budget to have spent on it.
Makes sense. I want to switch a little bit to a theme that both of you highlighted earlier, which is this concept of target accounts in fundraising and in enterprise sales, obviously. Let's take it a couple of different ways. To start with, talk about the journey you guys went through in sort of the evolution of the ideal customer. I think both of you have gone through a migration up market. Mm-hmm. What led you down that path, and how did your sales cycle have to evolve to kind of accommodate that?
Yeah, that is the huge key learning for us. Sounds like the same for TowDapp as well. And there's a really great parallel between the investing, the fundraising side and the sales side. For investment firms, whenever I'm coaching friends or advising companies on it, and they're thinking about raising money, they'll often have like, oh, I'd really like to raise money from this or that firm, but they don't have an understanding of the economics behind a particular fund. If someone has $1 billion fund and you're raising a seed round of funding, it's probably not worth getting that intro to them. It's just going to be a waste of your time. And similarly, if they only do consumer investments and you're a B2B company, that's probably not a good use of your time. So you really need to narrow down your list, which is going to directly increase the response rate from them, and it's just going to give you a much better chance of succeeding. And that's an early lesson that's important to learn. And then on the sales side, kind of had to relearn that lesson. And I think it's actually less about, some of it has to do with the size of the market, but your solution, like whatever you're building, you don't have enough resources to build every single checkbox on the planet. Like, you're not a big company. Typically, you've had some insight that's allowed you to build some smaller product than the other options out there, but a product that's unique in some way, and you need to find the smallest possible set of customers that is the best possible fit for what you've built, and that's going to give you just the strongest pitch to them. Do not waste your time on anybody else. And so there are a lot of things that can come along and be a distraction. Sometimes that big inbound account might be a scenario where it's like, oh, but I just need this one other feature, or they're not quite right. And then if you have a salesperson, they might waste time on that, or you as a founder might waste time on that. So it's really having the discipline to have a smaller number of people that you want to talk to, and you are that much more relevant to them.
Yeah, I agree. I have a very simple principle for this. Fundraising, sales, running companies, focus on what moves. I think as founders, you get caught up in your bigger vision and everything, and you want to do everything. There's this misconception in a lot of SaaS companies where you need to grow as fast as possible and not cede ground. And for majority of companies, some companies it does apply. Majority of SaaS companies, that does not apply. And so you need to focus on what moves when it comes to customers. Who's buying the most, buying more, and renewing constantly. And I'll give you a simple example. The last year that TowDAP was independent, we actually went through a very surgical re-architecture of the company. It was tough to do, but we went from 70 people to 30 people. We quadrupled our deal sizes, and we had the largest quarter in company history. And the principle of just focus on what moves was what worked really well. And so as you're having your initial conversations, whether you're fundraising or selling, figure out if there's real value that you can provide, and then focus on the ones that you think are actually going to move, and don't waste time on others. Don't waste time holding on because you don't want to cede ground to a competitor or something. Because if you double down on the area that works really well, you will grow faster, and then you earn the right to go after other segments that you seeded before. And believe it or not, with SaaS, people churn. Churn is a real thing. So you'll get those customers back if they go to your competitor. Just take a 3-year view on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the analogy actually of the bowling pin approach, where you get the first pin and then you want to get the ones that are closest to it. So don't hit down one pin in 3 different lanes. Like, stay in one lane. The other lanes will be available to you later.
Yeah.
I don't know how big of a sport bowling is in Europe. That's the first question that popped into my head. But anyway,
It's like, go put a bunch of Americans on stage. And we talk about football.
yeah, exactly. So I'm going to sprinkle in some of the questions that the audience has submitted just to keep this a little more dynamic. You know, since we're on the topic of target accounts and fundraising, why don't we take the question at the top of my screen here. What has been your biggest mistake when raising funding?
Oh, I have a few, but
I can go. Lots of lessons learned. So we raised a total of $20 million. Our Series A was $3 million. Our Series B was $15 million. Turns out whether you raise 3 or 15 or 20 or 30, you're probably going to spend it in about 18 to 24 months, unless like you literally split up the money, put it in a secret account, punch yourself, and forget about it. Like, everyone around the table is going to say, okay, how do we move faster and deploy the cash? So there is such a thing as not raising enough and raising too much. And that's been one of my biggest mistakes, quite honestly. Sometimes you just raise too much and go too hard. You want to be really purposeful about how much you raise, even if it's being offered to you, even if you're good at fundraising, because that sets the pace for what you're going to do over the next 2 to 3 years. So start first principles. What are your goals for growth? Who are your ideal customer profile, customers that you want to go after? And then figure out how much you should raise and deploy. Because you're going to probably spend it in about 18 months. That's generally how it works.
I have a template email which literally has a link to the Silicon Valley episode clips. Like, why didn't anyone tell me I could raise less money?
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. Anyway, unfortunately, in this funding environment, it comes up more often than it should. But it's a fair point.
on a slightly different topic for fundraising mistakes, one of the things I didn't realize was that there's no such thing as not pitching someone if you're giving them an update on your business. and and one of the things that can happen is if you're keeping in touch with someone and you're like, oh, I really want to raise money for them, they will kind of, if you see something along the way and increments, and then you try to have a grand reveal for the thing at the end, they're like, no, I've actually watched you the entire time. So it's like not the same for them as it is if you kind of sweep back the curtain in one fell swoop. So that's why I was saying earlier, it's best not to practice pitch on the people you want to actually raise money from. One good strategy if you're raising a seed round is to go to later stage people and practice on them because they are not actually going to give you money anyway, and then go back and do the real pitch with the people that you want to raise money from. And so I had that happen with a couple of investors early on, and that was the takeaway from that.
Great. You know, on some level, today's discussion is about scaling. Scaling requires people, and so I'm going to frame the question as follows. When, on the enterprise sales side, did you guys decide you needed help to hire an external VP of sales? And then let's answer that first, and we'll switch to fundraising and talk about whether you've gotten leverage from a team member. It could be a director of finance, somebody like that, an FP&A person, just to help you deal with all those pesky requests us investor types tend to send you. But let's talk about the VP of sales hire and when you felt like you were ready first.
I was ready yesterday. In that literally we had a VP of sales accept an offer yesterday.
He might have accepted yesterday. When did you need him?
Oh, even longer ago. But one of the other things I learned from going around and asking advice on this particular topic was that most people or most companies have their first VP of sales not work out. So I think there are real pros and cons to, as a founder, getting more or less involved in that part of your business. If you are a founder / former VP of sales, it's very different than if you're a founder / engineer. In DocSend's case, a lot of our interest has been inbound and word of mouth so far. And so we've built up a sales team that's actually done like pretty well. And so there are 9 on the sales team now. And so we've kind of gotten it to the stage where it makes sense to bring in that sales leader. And I've actually thought of it more as us building our resume as a company to get the type of person that we want to have in this job. And if I was in the shoes of VP of sales and I was looking at our company, there are certain things that I just think that they would want to see. And so I wanted to check those boxes before I went off and recruited for that position. And so that's kind of how we decided on the timing for that.
My rule for this is you always need to have 2. What I mean by that is if you're hiring your first rep, you need to hire 2 reps. If you're hiring your first SDR, you need to hire 2 SDRs. If you're hiring a VP of sales, unfortunately, you can't hire 2 VPs of sales. What that means is, even if the thing is, if you're in SaaS, you cannot outsource sales. If you're the founder, you're the VP of sales. You're the first VP of sales. Even when you hire a VP of sales, you're still the VP of sales or the chief revenue officer. You need to be involved in all the big deals. Ultimately, you have to pitch the customer, especially at stages that we're talking about in this conference. And so you gotta figure out a way to embrace selling. I don't care if you have to go to Brooks Brothers and buy suits, like just do it and get into the mode. And in terms of when you actually need to hire the VP of sales, I think ACV is like a good indicator. You're gonna eventually hit a point where it is beyond your mind that you can charge more. And then you need to find the VP of sales that looks at it and says, you know what, we could do 6-figure deals or $1 million deals, and you're stuck at doing 20K deals. Those are the times where you figured out how to sell, there's motion going, you can sell at a certain price point, and then you figure out how to go more up market and charge more. And you need to get the VP of sales that has the mindset that will shift your mindset to think, yeah, totally, we can charge 6 figures for this or 7 figures for this. That's when you know.
So let's take that hire. Let's forget the fundraising question and take this audience one. Sales requires confident people. How do you think about that first senior sales hire and company culture, and sort of carrying the flame of whatever culture you've built as a founder?
Oh, yeah, there's the whole cultural fit question. It depends on what type of business you are, if it's engineering run or sales run. I mean, some companies, they sell the thing before they build the thing, and therefore that question is not as relevant if you have like a strong engineering culture and you bring in the salesperson. Yeah, the 2 strategies I've heard that I like. One is to hire the up-and-coming salesperson who will just figure it out for you. The other one is to hire the more seasoned salesperson that has like done it before. For us, we actually hired in 3s. So we hired 3 salespeople originally with slightly different backgrounds. And we already had a bunch of people already using the product. And so they were closing some inbound and then like going off and looking at new verticals and new use cases for it. And that ended up working out pretty well in terms of it being a cultural fit. where they were just very curious, very product-oriented people. They were a good fit. I knew that we weren't ready to have like a quota system. Where we moved to a quota system pretty quickly, but having it be more exploratory at first. And the only people willing to do that are more business development or more junior people. So there's a real trade-off there. But they were willing to learn, and they were willing to work with the engineering team to get the feedback necessary to get the product to the state that was sellable with an outbound sales team.
Yeah, I kind of disagree with the question. I don't think you need confident types. I think you need people that really listen and can connect and engage with the customer. And I think it used to be, had to be the slick salesman when you couldn't Google everything about whatever you're buying anyway, and you had to go through that person. These days, the strong-arming, confident, like, trust me, I got you, like, doesn't work anymore. So I kind of disagree with the premise of the question. I think you need people that are good listeners, have high EQ, are good human beings, share the culture that you have, and have some belief in the product that they're selling and understand it. And that's I think, what I look for when I hire salespeople.
Great point. So we are basically out of time, guys. Rapid fire. Final thoughts for the audience. If there was one thing you could do differently on the journey you've been on to get to this point, in either fundraising and choosing an investor or those first enterprise accounts, what would you do differently?
I think for me, I would probably find a better sales mentor or advisor early on, and just invest in getting someone to help you with the areas that you aren't an expert at. And I think knowing your business well enough to know how important is that skill set of selling, and then being realistic about how long it will take you to develop that skill set, and then try to minimize that time. So don't try to be an expert at everything, but try to find the people who can help you and just shorten your overall time period.
Surgical mentorship. Fair enough.
I think if I could redo anything over the last 6 years in the TADUP journey, just even more time with customers. It just pays dividends. You learn 10 times more. Everything you ever talk about in terms of best practices, advisory boards, referrals, better customers, going up market, it all starts with spending more time with your best customers. You just learn so much that I would just put that at the top of your list and offset that with being heads down running the business.
Great. Thank you guys. Great thoughts, and thank you guys for listening.